Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. It's good to be here, and hello to everyone in the audience. As was mentioned, I was basically invited here to talk a little bit about renewable electricity and the options and some of the considerations around leadership and impact as it might relate to the carbon pilot program that you're all considering or involved with. So next slide. I'd like to just start a little bit with some basic information about the program that was just mentioned in the introduction. EPA launched the EPA Green Power Partnership in 2001, and as was mentioned, it's a voluntary program. We work with organizations across the United States to essentially buy and use renewable electricity to reduce the impacts associated with conventional electricity use. And so we work with any non-residential organization, and we work from facility level all the way up to entire organization wide footprints across the entire US. Next slide. To date, we have roughly a little over 700 partners, organizational partners. We also have a different class of partner called Green Power Communities, which is sort of an aggregation of a community or organizations and residences that can also become a partner in our program. The organizations alone are using, as of last year, well over 70 billion kilowatt hours of green power each year, which is roughly 6.6 million average Americans' homes, the electricity use that those homes would use. And the voluntary market is kind of a way to look at renewables. In the market, we have a lot of state renewable portfolio standards and regulations and mandates that certain entities like load serving entities and utilities are held to. But there's a whole bunch of organization and buyers out there that want to make a difference through their own actions. And so the voluntary market is squarely about those unregulated buyers in the market and having them make a difference through the choices they have in their electricity options. Next slide. As was mentioned, there's quite a few of you in today's audience that are familiar with our program and our partners in our program. Essentially, what I've learned over the years is that your organizations are probably as big as DOE or EPA. We tend to engage with a narrow set of points of contact, which may or may not be the same folks that are involved with this pilot program. So if you're interested in knowing who we speak with in your organization on a daily basis, if it's not you, be happy to crosswalk that. But we have quite a range of sectors that we cover within the corporate space. As you can see, there's also the city of Grand Rapids, which has I think it's some sort of wastewater treatment facility that's in our program, and so forth. And a couple of these partners are also facility level partners in our program, while others are organization wide, meaning all of their operations in the US are meeting our requirements. Next slide. So this is just a quick snapshot to give you a little sense of what our program has done over the years in terms of advancing voluntary consumption of green power. This is a recently released data visualization of our data, and that data comes to us from our partners and is, in this case, aggregated. And what the graphic on the left shows is the breakdown of different supply options that our partners are utilizing in the market today. We'll get into some of the details of those supply options here in a minute. But I think one of the key takeaways here is that unbundled RECs have played an important role in the market. However, as technology costs for renewables have decreased over time, and new policy and markets have opened up in different parts of the country, new supply options are now available, and some of those involve different costs. They also involve a range of different benefits for you as a consumer, and so we'll get into some of those. I also want to just make a note of what green power means to the EPA. Green power is a subset of renewable electricity, And it's representative of a set of resources that, from a voluntary buyer's perspective, carry the highest environmental benefit. And so not all renewables or resources that produce electricity have the same benefits. And so one of the things we ask our partners to do, as we'll talk about a little later, is choose resources that are of the highest quality and essentially put your investments in a position to make a difference. Next slide. So that gets us squarely to the principles and the things we ask of our partners in the market to do. And this is from a leadership. We're a leadership program. We're asking our leading partners to set examples and follow best practices in buying and using renewable electricity. The first thing that we point out is that consumers increasingly have a choice about how they can, where their power comes from and how it's generated. And so making a decision to proactively take an action to choose how that power is generated is a leading behavior that we're trying to encourage. Simply receiving what you get through the grid, which you have very little influence over in terms of what your standard default electricity supplier might provide you, is a very passive role in how you can make a difference on the grid and the emissions associated with electricity use. The next thing we ask is to have you focus on generation from new resources. You could focus on existing projects. You could also, focus on large hydropower that was built, in the early part of last century. All of that is good. It's zero emissions, it's renewable. But if you really want to make a difference in your investments, focusing on newer sources of generation or even newer projects are a good way to make a difference and have an impact. I also mentioned earlier that a lot of the renewables that are available to us through the standard default electricity service are as a result of mandates on load serving entities through renewable portfolio standards. We also want our voluntary partners in our program to make sure that their investments go above and beyond what those mandates will already create in the market. And so making sure that your investments are incremental to other sources or other sort of market drivers is important. I mentioned that buying high quality resources is something to consider. And then what backs all different types of supply options is essentially an overlay of the physical power grid that is represented by market instruments, a parallel system of market instruments that help distinguish ownership and trace and trackability of renewables on a shared grid from points of generation to ultimately points of use, where otherwise the physical power itself is hard to follow. So using market instruments becomes a key component to your greenhouse gas accounting, to your claims, and other things along those lines. So next slide, please. Our program is really based around establishing a minimum percentage or baseline minimum use that an organization has to meet in order to be a partner in our program. So on the left-hand column here, you'll see a range, a bunch of bands, we call them benchmarks, of how much annual electricity use your organization would use, or your facility if you're going to join only at a facility level. And essentially, you have to match up that minimum percentage in the right-hand column that has to be met by eligible resources that our program details in the program requirements document that's linked at the bottom of this slide here. Some people say, well, those percentages are kind of low. And in many ways they are, but I was really happy to hear Tom mention at the beginning that this is really about a journey. And for many organizations, some of your biggest challenges might be just getting the troops inside your organization rallied around committing to buying renewables. And so we have not found that setting 100% minimum targets to be a very good way of sort of approaching buying renewables. And what we found is that more than 50% of the generation that we measure through our program is actually through that journey of our partners initially buying and then increasing their purchase over time. So that increase is is more than half of the kilowatt hours that our program recognizes. Next slide. One thing I just want to tie this back to, because I imagine most of you have been probably focused on and interested in driving energy efficiency. Well, energy efficiency and green power work together essentially to lower your emissions, and efficiency reduces the quantity of kilowatt hours that you use. Green power is all about switching the fuel that you're relying on, or the emissions rate that kilowatt hour is ultimately associated with. And so these two things work in concert to ultimately reduce your carbon footprint. And then there's also other avoided emissions impacts that we're going to talk about here in a moment that helps you understand what kinds of impacts your investments are having on the system. Next slide. So at EPA, we break up the range of supply options that are available in today's market in really two different categories. There are retail options that you would go to your typical load serving entity or utility and procure through those mechanisms. Those are generally things like unbundled RECs, different kinds of utility products or programs that a utility might have. And then there's also community choice aggregation, which is a mechanism by which communities can choose how power is generated for the community at large. And those are that's available only in some states like California and a few other progressive states. But by and large, if you want economic benefits, you're going to have to look towards project-specific options. We don't differentiate between on-site and off-site. We have lots of partners who generate and own and operate their own solar or wind farms. And so we look at it more from an ownership or self-supply versus third-party purchase arrangements. And so self-supply would be any project on-site or off-site that you own and operate for your own benefit. Physical PPAs, shared renewables, tariffs, and financial contracts, also known as VPPAs, which is one of the items that our poll indicated you were interested in, are all going to be projects that are owned and operated by a third party that you are buying some output from. And so those types of financing arrangements address a few challenges for you, but they also offer you a few opportunities. We'll get into that here in a second. Next slide. So one thing I just want to sort of note for you here in looking at this slide is if you're at all cost conscious about what you're going to do in the renewable energy space, you can kind of draw a line here around, between these different options. And by and large, generally, the two top options are always going to cost you more than what your conventional electricity service will cost you. And it's partly the way these products are designed and sort of purchased in the market. But anything below that line has the potential to save you money. And so I would, given that most companies and organizations are interested in the economic consequences of these choices, this is a good point to just remember as we move through this discussion. Next slide. So just a little bit of understanding of what's going on in the market. The National Renewable Energy Lab does a state of the voluntary market report every year. And I've actually excerpted this graphic here. It's a regular graphic that they featured every year for the past, 4 or 5 years maybe. This is the most recent report that's actually not public yet, but I was able to get my hands on the graphic. But the big story here is that you can see from a retail sales perspective across the US, voluntary procurements are largely comprised of unbundled REC procurements by our partners and organizations in the market. You also can see that PPAs and different types of utility tariff contracts and also CCAs are playing an increasing role relative to unbundled RECs. There's also a wide range of participation numbers. CCAs, because they cover local jurisdictions, meaning like within a city limits of all electricity providers, they cover a lot of people, but not as much sales. relatively speaking. And unbundled RECs also are purchased largely by essentially a number of parties in the market. So next slide, please. One thing that we did a few years ago is we were kind of curious about the landscape from an access to these different supply options. And generally speaking, while this data is a little bit dated at this point, being 2016 data, I don't think the market has changed tremendously a lot since we did this analysis. But I think the big picture takeaway here that I want to share with you is that depending on who you are and where you're located, your access and ability to access impactful renewable energy supply options will vary depending on your situation. So the one thing that I can say is every consumer in the US does have access to unbundled RECs, which is why it is the only one here that at the bottom of the table that shows that it's available in all 50 states, and it covers all customers and all electricity sales potentially. But unbundled RECs have some limitations in the impact they can have, as well as the cost premium that they come to you in the market. So I want you to just take away from this that you're going to have to do some investigation for your portfolio of operations or for single facilities to understand what options you have available. Next slide. Which brings us to the idea around impact. And impact's kind of an interesting topic for us here at EPA. It's something we think about a lot because we really want the investments that our voluntary partners are making to make a difference and have impact. But because of that landscape of access being so balkanized around the US, impact is not necessarily a straightforward sort of calculus for everyone. Also, different organizations may have different interests in mind. You may, obviously, with this pilot that we're speaking to today, emissions is one of the big things. But unless you're in the dirtiest part of the grid, there's always a dirtier part of the grid. You could cite a project to reduce emissions. But some people want to have impact on a more local grid basis, so a spatial or geographic impact kind of requirement, which may actually sort of challenge some of the emissions reductions from an avoided emissions perspective you might be able to achieve. If you're worried about economics, that might push your projects into a different bucket or region of the country. If you start, restricting your project options down to certain resources are prevalent in certain parts of the country, but not in others. So all of these things start to sort of push you uniquely in different directions in different ways around what kinds of impact you can have. We generally want you to just do credible actions that result in the most impact that you can undertake through your investments. Next slide. So I'm not going to blind you too much other than having to look at this very bright slide, but it's bright for a reason. It's because this is a super important credibility message. You're only using renewable electricity when you have both the REC, that is the market instrument, and the electricity together. RECs have value because people can use them to claim ownership to renewable energy on the shared grid. And so if you sell them, you are selling somebody that claim to that unit of generation that is used to meet demand. And so ultimately, you will be presented with a trade-off between wanting to monetize your RECs in order to drive the cost of the physical power that you receive from the project lower. But in doing so, you may also have to give up some of the claims and the ownership to the renewableness of that physical power. So this is a really important concept. RECs also prevent double counting. And so if you go down the road of selling your RECs, but also counting it as still renewable energy, that's a double counting situation. And that's only going to get us halfway to a deeply decarbonized future. So market instruments are really important. Now, I'm just going to quickly go through a few resources. So the next slides, we can kind of click through here in somewhat fast fashion. If you're just starting out and you'd have no experience in buying renewable energy, I would point you to the Guide to Purchasing Green Power. This is a document that was authored in part through the coordination of effort between the Department of Energy, EPA, the World Resources Institute, that is the owner of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the corporate standard that many of your organizations are probably measuring your emissions through in order to manage them. The Center for Resource Solutions, which is a third-party certifying program that certifies retail green power products in the market and also sets national standards for resource quality from a voluntary market perspective. And there are several chapters that were authored by NREL on some of the more complex supply options that many of our partners are undertaking, such as PPAs and virtual power purchase agreements. Next slide. If you are interested in measuring some of the benefits that your investments will make, I would recommend taking a look at the AVERT tool. This is a tool that allows you to look at the project or program impact emissions of your investments across a number of different emissions types. You can see that each of these logos on here has the URL where you can access these tools. AVERT is not an appropriate tool to use for your corporate greenhouse gas accounting. There are other options available for that I'd be happy to talk about, but I think you may have had a previous webinar on that topic. And then COBRA, for those of you who might be interested in calculating health benefits like avoided mortality and those kinds of things, COBRA basically is a modeling tool that allows you to identify the co-benefits on health impacts and screening of different projects. So I know that I think AstraZeneca is in the healthcare sector. You might be interested in understanding what your investments might mean for health benefits in your business sector in particular. Next slide. EPA is also, through actually an interagency agreement with the Department of Energy, the Solar Technologies Office in particular, has developed a searchable resource directory that dives into a range of different topics about RE project development. I would direct you there if you have a particular issue that you're looking for a solution. Go to the searchable resource directory. You can sort of drill into that and see if there's any resources. If you know of any resources that are missing from that you think should be there, feel free to send them our way. We'll see if we can get them posted. But that's a good resource to have in the back of your pocket if you're looking for some credible resources. And so with that, I think that's takes us to my last slide, which is simply feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about the program. And I look forward to answering any questions that you might have either now or later.
All right, excellent, James. That was fantastic, and I think you provided a good overlay of all the resources that are available. The EPA has this is not a new space for the EPA, as you can tell. Like James and their team has been working just as hard on the renewable side as the better plants and the DOE has been on the energy efficiency side. And so I feel like James, you did a great job, but it's still just the tip of the iceberg in that renewable space. And so with that said, we're going to start to pivot a little bit where we're going to have a case study. Essentially, we have Laura from Cummins, and Cummins has been doing some really fantastic work in pushing the envelope, right? And I know for a lot of you heard what James was saying, and that look, there's unbundled RECs, and you can get things that have been in existence for a long time, but that's probably not where most of your organizations and where your management wants to be, or the light that they want to be in. They want to help push the market forward and help be an enabler and a leader in that space. And so Laura, I think, will really touch on some of this stuff. And with that said, I will also throw out, if you do have questions for James, put them in the chat, or I know a lot of you are in the Slido system. Enter your questions in, and that way when we get to the end, we can come back and work through those. Okay. So with that, Laura, let's transition over here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate that. That was a great presentation. James learned a lot and a lot of connections to what I'm going to be talking about too today. So I'm going to start off with just a little bit of a background with Cummins and where we're at with our journey. So Cummins, if you're not aware, is a global company with our headquarters in Indianapolis, or in Columbus, Indiana. We have 5 distinct business units, the newest one being New Power, which is where our electrified power and our fuel cell and hydrogen technologies exist. We have over 104 manufacturing plants worldwide and several offices, tech centers, warehouses as well in our footprint. Next slide. In 2019, we launched our Planet 2050 initiative. It's an acronym there. We love acronyms at Cummins, but we set out these 2050 aims or aspirational targets, but then also established some 2030 goals. So we have a 2030 goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, the absolute emissions, by 50% for our facilities and operations. And then, you know, as a forward-looking or aspiration for looking forward to 2050 to achieve carbon neutrality and near zero emissions in our Cummins facilities and operations. So all of this, you know, with the renewables is going to play a key role in achieving those goals. Next slide. So just to give a little bit more background, our footprint here, you can see what our global footprint was and our greenhouse gas emissions. And then a pie chart to the right that shows the emission sources for that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this VPPA offset that we have, which represents 18% of our emissions sources from 2020. That is the Indiana wind farm financial contract that we entered into in 2019. And that substantially reduced our greenhouse gas footprint. You can go to the next slide. I think it shows kind of the impact of those emissions. So you can see our emissions over the past several years have maybe remained flat, sometimes decreasing, sometimes increasing, but our intensity has been decreasing all along up till our 2020 goal. In 2019, you can see that drastic drop. That was the impact of the VPPA agreement. And then in 2020, another little drop where our intensity actually rose. Our intensity measure is per man hour. So during COVID, our overall energy dropped a little bit more, but our man hours decreased as well, which made that intensity go up. Now, from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint, when you take that VPPA out of our footprint from an emission source, it does actually put a little bit more of a spotlight on our fossil fuels from diesel and natural gas that we use on site, which kind of just highlights the need to also focus in those areas. Next slide. So I just also wanted to share, you know, how we arrived on some of our goals in establishing our science-based targets. This is a model that was created to help us understand where we needed to focus, what was the art of possible. The model assumes a 3% business growth year over year. And really this, you know, we're looking at our critical X's on the right-hand side, and I've highlighted the on-site and off-site renewables as key components to achieving our goals. As James mentioned, we're also focused, you know, first and foremost on efficiency. You have to reduce first before you can, you know, utilize renewables. We have a lot of areas where we're focused on reducing throughout energy efficiency, from our product development and our product testing. Tom's comment about the firing on all cylinders, you know, we are an engine development company, and so we do burn a lot of diesel and natural gas, and that is part of our core business, but there are potential to reduce there as well. Next slide. So I also wanted to talk just a little bit about on-site renewables, and then towards the end, we'll focus on that VPPA project in northern Indiana. So we're just now launching a campaign, if you will, in North America where we've established an internal starting point or achievement goal of about 10% for on-site solar of our current usage. Now, we don't know, the question we're trying to figure out and ask is, do we need more? Can we do more? Is the space available? What is the potential for on-site? And then that will help us understand really our need for off-site as well. Of course, we have to balance this with all the other critical X's that were mentioned around efficiency and reductions in other areas. So if we can't achieve, a certain percentage reduction in one of the other areas, then another one's going to have to increase. There are several goals established or objectives here for this renewable program that we're just launching. The first one there is we want to have a sustainable model that's cost effective. Obviously, it needs to support our Planet 20 vision. Cummins definitely wants to own those green attributes or RECs that James talked about. And then we also want to be consistent with our corporate renewable guiding principles. Next slide. So as mentioned before, we're taking that approach of use less, use better, use again. So, efficiency first, using better power in the way of renewables, and then, recovering energy from our test cells, or, having battery storage so that we can use all of the energy that we produce on site at our facilities. So that's the first step in looking at that hierarchy. We also have a system-based approach, and we look at it from a risk prioritization as well. When we were doing the VPPA, getting that approved, it took several years to get that approved through our leadership. And in that process, these four guiding principles were established. So for any renewable, we wanted it to be additional, and James touched on that as well. We wanted it to really be either a new project or supporting something that maybe wouldn't happen without Cummins's backing and Cummins support of that project. We wanted it to be tangible. So how can we connect it to the Cummins footprint, and does it really make an impact to our stakeholders? And then obviously cost effective. We want to have the most cost effective contracts, whether it be virtual or on site. And we're doing that through the campaign approach as well, so we can leverage regional costs. And then lastly, transparent. So we want to make sure that our contracts are clear, the counting is complete, and we have a transparent disclosure of what we're doing and why and how. So obviously we make our environmental status public through the Carbon Disclosure Project and the DOE reporting guidelines. So these four guiding principles really helped us focus in on what kinds of projects we wanted to engage in. And the wind farm that we got approved and started operational in 2019 really hit on all of these: additional, tangible, cost effective, and transparent. And we're taking this throughout our renewable strategy. Next slide. So a little bit more on our renewable approach. Like I mentioned, regional approach here. We're split into 4 regions around the globe. So we've already done a campaign in Asia Pacific, focused in China and India. We're looking heavily and have done several projects in Africa and Mexico. And now we're looking at North America as another region to look at this on-site renewables. We want to understand what the roof capacity is, how much space is available. So all of these things we're taking into account for our prioritization. We also are actively, constantly building new plants, new offices, new warehouses. And in our building standards, we've included provisions in there for solar from day one during construction projects. We want to make sure that we can also sustain these renewable energy programs once they're installed by establishing operation and maintenance contracts, monitoring the predicted versus the actual generation, and then establishing reporting guidelines. Next slide. So just a little bit more on the solar prioritization, and this is mostly for on-site, but I think it applies as well to off-site. We're looking at this right now in North America, but we want to obviously maximize our generation potential. So looking at the solar radiation, looking at the bang for the buck, looking at our high power tariffs, where those exist, where we have financial savings and incentives potential. We want to look at the environmental risk. I think James mentioned that as well. So where is the grid carbon intensity the worst? And, we want to really make that impact on reducing greenhouse gases. And then strategically thinking, where do they make sense for Cummins? Can we incorporate a microgrid or some of our own Cummins technology, whether it's power generation or battery storage or controls technology for those systems? We do have an electric vehicle strategy, and obviously tying that back to our Planet 2050 strategy. Next slide. One more click there. So this is just a little bit more on that prioritization. We're in the middle of this now. We've initially sized everything based on capacity to use on site and not return to the grid. But obviously we can add future expansions for storage and export potential. Next slide. I think this is the summary really of talk a little bit more about the Meadow Lake Wind Farm. You can see there, Cummins Renewable Strategy kind of has both the off-site and the on-site renewables. The Meadow Lake Wind Farm expansion was actually expansion to an existing wind farm in Indiana. The portion that Cummins supported produces 75. It has a 75 megawatt peak capacity at 235,000 megawatt hours per year generation. So there you can see it represents that 18%, which we saw earlier on the overall Cummins footprint. But really we were focused on, and we've sized the farm to be roughly equivalent to the Indiana Cummins footprint. And so I think it says 90 plus here, we're I think about 98% of what our current Cummins Indiana sites electrical consumption is. And so that speaks to that tangible, as maybe we are not getting the same exact electrons from this wind farm, but with it being in Indiana and with having as much of our Indiana footprint that we do have here for our corporate headquarters, it made it really tangible for the company visibly. On-site solar. So you can see we've done quite a bit there. This is a picture of our Juarez, Mexico plant with carport solar installed. We've got 36 completed installs for 20 megawatts and another 11 going on right now all over the world. Currently, we have 2 large ones in the United States being installed in Fridley, Minnesota, and then another one in Rocky Mount, North Carolina for 3.6 megawatts. Just to add a note there, I think James mentioned, Cummins is one of the Green Power partners with a lot of the other folks on the line here, and we're really, happy to be able to be recognized in that group. I think in the industrial and automotive categories, there are only 5 other companies that use more green power than Cummins, and we're really looking to increase our percentage in the next several years. The next slide, just a little bit more details on the VPPA that we did. Like I mentioned, the guiding principles before, so that was important. Our leadership was very clear in not wanting to just purchase these RECs. We want it to be tangible and additional. So we have those guiding principles now for us. I've got a link there. It shows the Rocky Mountain Institute developed case study for your reference on the Cummins Virtual Power Purchase Agreement. You can find that there. We also took a very deep dive into a risk mitigation approach. On the far right-hand side, you can see kind of a summary, I guess, of our approach. And it's important, and I think James touched on this as well. It's important to know and understand where your company's concerns are and what is the impact that you want to make. Cummins is extremely risk-adverse company in general, and we did not want to risk making an impact, a negative impact to the community, for the reputation, to the environment. So we looked at all of these areas, and you can see here where we started out initially with a lot of red and yellow, and through mitigating and through communication, we were able to get those over the hump to a more acceptable green category, and be happy with those mitigations and potential risks. It's also important to know that this was an expansion to an existing wind farm, which also helped in understanding the potential risk of the local community. Lastly, I'll just mention another resource here, is the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. They provide a lot of really valuable guidance as well on how to do these renewable deals. You can learn, network, and develop through the REBA organization. For Cummins, we hired a third-party consultant to help us through the VPPA, and found that support was critical to help us sort through the process, both with the partners that we worked with, as well as our own leadership and working through that risk-based approach.